Good morning, everybody. My name is Mike Balkwill. I work as the campaign director with the Wellington Water Watchers. Thank you all very much for joining us this morning for this very interesting and important webinar on the topic of water privatization. I'm going to ask Megan Clout, who works with us as our communications coordinator, to come on and explain the Zoom etiquette for this meeting. Megan.
Hi, everybody. Thanks for joining us. So a few things before we get started. We are using Zoom webinar today, so you'll notice that it's just a little bit different than a regular Zoom meeting. So there's a few things to note. We're going to ask that you introduce yourself through the chat box, which you'll find at the bottom of your screen beside share screen. And in the chat box, if you click the blue drop-down menu, you'll see you have two options: to message all panelists and to message panelists and attendees. So we're going to ask you to use the panelists and attendees so everybody can see. If you have any questions, you'll see at the bottom of your screen, over to the other side of the share screen, you have a Q&A button. So if you click on that, you'll be able to first ask questions and then also vote for other people's questions. So if you see a question in there that you would really like answered, click the thumbs up button in there. If you are joining over the phone and have a question, you can email it to me at megan@wellingtonwaterwatchers.ca and I'll add it into the question box. And finally, if you have any questions or are having any tech issues, you can either put them in the chat box or email them to myself at that same email, Megan, MEGHAN, @wellingtonwaterwatchers.ca. And we are recording this event so that we can share it with you afterwards. All right, Mike, back to you.
Thank you, Megan. So we're very pleased today to have three speakers, and I'm going to introduce them briefly. Andrea Muehlebach, who teaches at the University of Toronto, and a major focus of her study has been social movements in Europe, people's movements to re-municipalize water systems that have been made private. And Andrea is going to give us kind of a global view of the agenda, the corporate agenda to privatize public water systems. We're very glad Robert Ramsay, who's a researcher with the Canadian Union of Employees, can join us today. And he's going to focus in, he's going to take us from the global level down to the national level and talk about the Canadian government's agenda and strategy to privatize water systems. Then VBI from the Council of Canadians is going to bring us and focus right on Mapleton, Ontario, which is in the northwest corner of Wellington County, where they're proposing a pilot project for water privatization. Each of these, we've pre-recorded the presentations of each of these people so that there wouldn't be any glitches in the transmission. And there's probably 25 or 30 minutes of presentation, which you'll find very interesting. And then we're going to open it up after that to a Q&A. And then finally, in closing, we're going to talk about how you can become involved in the campaign to say no to the proposed privatization of the water and wastewater system in Mapleton. So that's the agenda. And I always like to ask people when we're getting ready to start, are we at the same meeting? So I hope we're at the same meeting. And I'm going to ask Megan if she'll start the presentations for us.
I'd like to introduce myself here. My name is Andrea Muehlebach, and I'm a professor of anthropology at the University of Toronto. I came to the topic of water privatization and the resistance against water privatization because there was just so many mobilizations in Europe where I do much of my research, all of my research really. against the privatization of water utilities. So I came to this theme from below, being very interested in the different strategies that groups use to mobilize against the privatization of water. And it was only through them that I was really introduced into and learned about what it actually means to privatize and really financialize a public water utility. And of course, the model being used universally there is that of the public-private partnership. And so it was, again, through activists on the local level that I began to read up on these larger global processes that are happening, as I just said, globally. And so what I'll be doing today is speak specifically about some of the things that I've noted in Europe. I traveled widely in Italy, Germany, Ireland, with also stopovers in France and Greece. And so have a relatively solid sense of what the different groups in Europe are doing, even though there's always more protests, there's always more mobilizations going on against the privatization of water. So what I'll do now is I'm going to share my screen and I am going to show you a few slides. I decided to just call this talk Political Mobilizations Against the Privatization of Public Water Utilities through Public-Private Partnerships. And this is a brief view of Europe. So very broadly, I was asked to speak a little bit about some of the main global actors involved in the privatization of public water utilities. Many of you will already know the names, Suez and Veolia. These are the world's largest private international water and wastewater companies. They're both French. And there are, however, also many, many more national level water corporations, of course, and I've listed a few here. Thames Water is a very, very large one, United Water in the US, Aguas de Barcelona in Barcelona, Acea in Italy, and RWE in Germany. RWE is actually a multi-utility that actually deals mainly with electricity, but in the case that I was studying of Berlin, they were also beginning to invest in water. Many of these water utilities that are of a national level, of course, are also in part subsidiaries of Suez. So Suez and Veolia will have shares in almost all of these national utilities. So some of these smaller corporations like Acea might not have the name recognition that Suez and Veolia have, but they really all play by the same playbook. As I just said, and apologies, this is a small slide that will just give you an overview over the world's largest water companies. So as an anthropologist, I was particularly interested in the resistance that came from below. I worked in Italy, in Germany, and in France. And before I talk a little bit about the individual cases, I just wanted to note that in all cases that I studied, and not surprisingly to anyone who knows a little bit about the topic, the P3 model ended up raising several problems which activists dealt with in different ways. So in all cases, in all countries, you actually saw an escalation of water prices that came with the privatization of the public water utility. There was always a lack of transparency. So contracts, of course, were subject to non-disclosure agreements. So activists could not actually see the content of the contracts that governed what they believed was their resource. There was always a problem of de-democratization. So they had no more say or very little say in how water is governed and priced. There was always a loss of jobs in the utility, and activists often said that that also came with a loss of know-how. So people who had worked in the utility for 5, 10, 20 years and knew the infrastructure very well were suddenly kicked out. There was often also a problem of uneven access to water. So in Italy, shutoffs, where shutoffs are legal, shutoffs increased quite a bit after the private corporations took over. There was always a decreased investment in infrastructure because, of course, the primary motivation now was to service debts to global investors rather than to actually take care of the resource. And there was, by implication, always an acceleration of public debt. So many activists would say that, you know, the steadily growing bills that they got at the end of the month, at the end of the trimester, was actually a reflection not of the fact that the corporation was investing in the infrastructure or making the management of the resource more efficient. It was actually a reflection of the fact that the utility was suddenly very, very strongly indebted and was to be indebted for the next generation, essentially, because as we know, PPP contracts are often about 30 years long or longer. So to move on to the three case studies, Berlin, Germany is a very, very famous popular mobilization against the partial privatization of the water utility. This was a citywide popular mobilization that fought and won against the partial privatization of the utility. And it was won by popular referendum in 2011. And this popular referendum, importantly, was not a referendum that forced the city to remunicipalize. It was a popular referendum around the fact that the contracts had never been disclosed to the people. So this is a referendum that explicitly sought for transparency and for an unveiling, essentially, of the mechanisms of predation, one can say, that are embedded in these contracts. The argument here was that water is a commonly held resource that belongs to all, and it should therefore be managed in a transparent way and in a democratic way, and in a way that entails the direct participation of citizens. It's very important here to note that their campaigns could not have moved forward without several important rulings by the Berlin courts, because the political classes are, of course, invested in contracts with private actors. They actually fought the Berlin water table, as this group of people called itself, tooth and nail and every step of the way. So every step of this popular initiative and popular referendum, they actually had to go to court and fight for their right to do it. Eventually, the contracts were disclosed. The political pressure on the ruling leftist coalition, not a rightist, but a leftist coalition, was so strong that Berlin's water was remunicipalized in 2014, and since then has been declared actually a blue community. In the case of Italy, this was a national mobilization here that involved, first of all, the collective writing of a water bill by the people of Italy with the help actually of a group of lawyers who argued that really Italians need to begin to rethink the whole conception of property and what kind of property water actually is. The argument was that water should never be private property, but it should also never be thought of just as public property, because in fact the state had treated water as if it were its own property and as if it could just sell off this commonly held resource to financial actors. And so the argument on the part of the Italians was we need to go beyond the public-private binary and think of water, in fact, as a commons, or a bene comune, as the Italians put it. And it was actually with the help of the Catholic Church, many lawyers, many unions and so on, but also many local mayors, that the bill was written and eventually a national referendum was voted on. So like the Berlin water table in 2011, the Italians voted, I think it was 92% of the Italian population voted against the privatization of water. This was a partial success here. It at least stopped the partial privatization of many local and sort of medium level water utilities in the country. In many large cities in Italy, water utilities are still partially privatized, but there are some exceptions. For example, Naples, after the referendum, managed to fully municipalize its partially privatized water utility, and the battle is still ongoing. In Paris, which is another very famous example of remunicipalization, it needs to be said that this was not really a popular mobilization. Rather, this was a campaign that was run in many ways, an initiative that was run by Paris's then deputy mayor, Anne Lestra, who's featured here. And she ran on a platform in 2007, 2008 that emphasized, again, that water is a public good and that it should be managed by public authority. This was after the city of Paris had set up a specialized unit to monitor the activities of private operators, specifically because there had been a lack of investment in Paris's infrastructures, and specifically because they had failed to improve water network efficiency. So this, of course, is a common problem, that the language that is used by international investors and water corporations is often that they will be more efficient. That is often not necessarily the case at all. when it turned out that things were just not moving in the right direction, Anne Lustra and her coalition, which was a Green Social Democratic coalition, was voted into power. They then waited for the contract which Paris had with Suez and Veolia to end. And once it ended, they decided not to renew the contract. So there are two ways in which remunicipalization can happen, or has happened in my cases. One is the municipality waits for the contract to end, and then they just don't renew the contract, which is in some ways much easier than what Berlin did, which is they terminated the contract and bought back the shares that Veolia held of the public utility. And of course, that was an extremely expensive process, with the end effect that Berlin, until this day, is even more indebted because it has to pay back the buyback of these shares from Veolia. I think that when I think about 2 or 3 points that I want to end with regards to public-private partnerships, protest, and remunicipalization, is that PPPs, once they happen, they of course, because it's a so-called partnership with emphasis on so-called, it has to happen, of course, with the consent and initiative of politicians. This means that the purely political route is often closed or very, very tricky. Because also politicians often will argue that their water, in fact, is not privatized. They'll argue that the majority of shares is still within public hands, and therefore it's not privatized. But we've already seen that sort of the logics of private debt financing will suffuse the public utility, which then proceeds to be sort of embroiled in having to pay back the debt, which then, is of course profits that lines investors' pockets. So the political pressure has to be very, very intense and come from below. As I already said, the focus on mayors has been somewhat effective in some of the contexts I've worked with. But it also means that a lot of activists that I knew actually took the route of the law in the courts because the political situation was so intransigent, and hence the popular referenda and court cases that I talked about above. I wanted to just end now with some additional links and just one last thought. I think the case of Europe shows that the best strategy is really never to let public-private partnerships into your door, because it's very complicated and also very expensive to remunicipalize at times, as was the case in Berlin. The Ontario Auditor General report on P3s, and this is a QP link that I'm giving you, would agree with that. Public-private partnerships are, in the long run, not a good fiscal choice for local governments at all. These are purely political choices that depend in some ways on the sort of sacrality of balanced budgets and the idea that local governments should not take out loans for something even as important as water infrastructures. Rather, they should partially privatize and let investors take out loans, which is much more expensive than if local governments take out loans, hence the debt spiral that local governments then end in. So the Auditor General actually has a very critical view of public-private partnerships as they've already taken place in our province. There's a good report here that I'll leave you with about water privatization of facts and figures by Food and Water Watch in the US. I think it's a very good document to have and to read through. And then finally, this is a water remunicipalization tracker, which I recommend for anyone who wants to look at how and to what degree water has been remunicipalized in different parts of the world already. So this is the end of what I have to say for now, and I'll stop sharing my screen.
Thanks, Andrea, for giving us that large-scale, global, international view of water privatization. We're now going to hear from Robert Ramsay, a researcher with CUPE National, Canadian Union of Public Employees, and we're going to look at the situation here in Canada now. Robert.
Okay, hello everyone. My name is Robert Ramsay. I'm a researcher with CUPE National in the national office in Ottawa. I have the municipal assignment, so water is one of the areas that that I keep track of and look at and work with our allies on. So I appreciate the invitation to come and talk to this group about what's happening specifically in Mapleton, but what's happening sort of in a larger sense with efforts to privatize public water systems in Canada. All right. I mean, to encapsulate CUPE's position on this, the title of my presentation is Water Privatization, No Thanks. And what we see internationally and domestically is that is what the research really indicates. Water privatization, public-private partnerships on water, and private operation of public water and wastewater systems does not show itself to be the ideal way to provide this utility. So what we've seen globally, and what Andrea outlined in her presentation beautifully, is this trend of moving away from privatized water and wastewater systems and remunicipalizing these systems or deprivatizing these systems. And the Transnational Institute, which is based in Amsterdam, has been doing some great research over the past few years on the remunicipalization of water and wastewater services, actually public services in general. But their research has identified approximately 320 cases around the world where municipalities have brought those privatized water and wastewater services back in-house. There's the website URL here for you if you want to check that out. They have a very convenient search tool. 8 of those cases are from Canada. White Rock, BC, which I already mentioned, Hamilton, Ontario, which was about a decade ago. They privatized their water treatment. It resulted in, catastrophic spills into the harbor and a lot of quality and delivery problems. That was reversed. A number of other examples where municipalities have brought those services back in-house. There have also been cases in Canada where cities have voted to stop or have reversed privatizations. Abbotsford, BC voted to reject a P3 proposal in their municipality. Moncton, New Brunswick, a couple of times has had to pull back on their P3 plans because of pushback. Regina is sort of a counterexample in that the referenda there actually passed. So a slim majority of voters approved it there, but there has been a great deal of reporting on some of the misinformation during that campaign that was put out by the municipality and the private company that were involved, the private consortium. So to conclude, just a few points from the jumble of what I've said. First of all, municipalities we know are strapped for cash, even more so now because of the pandemic and depleted revenues. And so the false allure of P3s and privatization could be tempting to municipalities. The Canada Infrastructure Bank, our position was they could have offered low-cost loans directly to municipalities, to Mapleton, for example. And we've been calling for this bank to be converted into a public bank that supports local governments with low-cost financing, for example, similar to the Municipal Finance Authority of BC, which does just this at very low borrowing rates. And I guess I'll just say in closing that what we need to understand about what the Canada Infrastructure Bank is trying to do in Mapleton, but in general in the water and wastewater sector in Canada, is a fringe position. This is not mainstream. It's not mainstream in Canada. It's not mainstream globally. In fact, internationally, municipalities are moving away from privatization. And so what's happening in Mapleton should be seen not as something that is following a regular pattern or something that is justified by past experience. It is in fact something new. It is a fringe position and one that is not supported by the research or experiences of other municipalities. Thanks.
Thanks, Robert. Now we're going to hear from VBI Water campaigner with the Council of Canadians. And we're going to zero in now on Mapleton, Ontario, which is in the northwest corner of Wellington County, and hear about what's happening there. V.
All right, so thank you everyone for tuning in. My name is V. Bowie and I'm the water campaigner for the Council of Canadians. Very honored to have this opportunity to speak to you all today about Mapleton and water privatization in Canada. So we have the opportunity to hear from Andrea and Robert about water privatization and public-private partnerships in Canada. And I'm hoping to dive a little bit deeper into a case happening right here in Wellington County with Mapleton. So in 2019, the Canada Infrastructure Bank announced a $20 million investment in water and wastewater project in Mapleton, calling it an innovative funding model. And before we dive into unpacking that, I'm hoping to let you folks know a little bit more about Mapleton. So it's a township right here in Wellington County. So a lot of you folks watching this would be a lot more familiar with it. The population is about 11,000 people, and the township consists of several smaller towns like Drayton, Moorfield, Ramsay. And the township has been seeking funding from higher levels of government for its water infrastructure upgrades for a few years now. So we have been able through our research to find a couple applications that failed to secure funding for a new water tower in 2012, 2013, and 2014. So what we know is that water and sewage treatment infrastructure is a real need in the community, but unfortunately securing funding has been a challenge. So in comes the Canada Infrastructure Bank with their $20 million investment, and even though they can call it all sorts of names, we know that at the core, this is a public-private partnership. So as part of this agreement, the township is now seeking a consortium, so a group of companies, private or public, to finance, design, and build some new infrastructure, as well as for the same consortium to take over the operation and maintenance of both the new and existing infrastructure for the next 20 years. So we know that the new infrastructure, which includes some water tower, a water treatment pilot, some sanitation ponds, et cetera, is valued at between $15 and $30 million. But we don't know how much the maintenance and operation piece will cost. Under this proposal, the township will still own the infrastructure, but the water and wastewater services will be in the hand of a private consortium for 20 years. And that's why at the core, it's a public-private partnership. And I think Andrea and Robert have gone through why, when it comes to water, an essential service that directly relates to public health, that is concerned that it's a problem when we let a private company handle it. P3 have been well proven to be a costly, inefficient model. And throughout the process that the township has been engaging with this, we continue to see those hallmarks of a P3 projects. So since the township put out their request for proposal in 2019, all the discussion has taken place at City Council in closed session, so behind closed doors. There's very limited to no information to the public about what has been discussed. And the only document available, even after our friends at QP have put in some access to information request, is a business case put together by PricewaterhouseCoopers. What we know so far is that the request for proposal went out in 2019. At the beginning of this year, they received 3 proposals. They were going to review and announce a winning bidder by March of 2020, but that hasn't happened yet. And the process seemed to be delayed, and we have no idea why. So we also did take a deeper look into the business case, which is the only document available with some key information redacted, where they compare various funding options before concluding that the model with the CIB is the best thing for the township. So when they compare, say, this model with an option where the township had to pay for everything through their water and user rate, they just say that, yeah, CIB is coming out the best, but this is assuming some huge assumption, including large risk transfer value. So the assumption is that when a private sector take on something instead of the municipality, then we're no longer at risk, and therefore we save some money. But the truth is that that's not true. This is a water and wastewater project. When sewage spill, when there's no running water, when there's issue with the quality of your drinking water, it is the township, it is the residents that's ultimately at risk and have to bear responsibility. In fact, the Ontario Auditor General have reported several times that risk transfer factor in P3 projects are often inflated without evidence, often to favor the P3 option. And this report also failed to take into account many of the federal and provincial grants that have been made available significantly more recently that will help the municipality with the infrastructure project. In fact, this township have received money from the province for infrastructure since the beginning of this project. And we also continue to have other concerns around that we always have around water P3, including higher water rates, which more often than not affect the most lowest income residents first. We know that we're seeing a loss of accountability. Instead of having concerns with your township councillor, you're now dealing with a faceless consortium that have no interest in the public, in your public health. And it could also violate the human right to water, and as they are unlikely to make investments that put the public interest first and foremost. Another concern that we have around this whole project is how the federal government is spending tax money through the infrastructure bank. So the loan terms for the $20 million investment were blacked out, but we were able to find out through the Wellington appetizer that they're essentially lending at 2% for the first 5 years and 3% interest rate for the remaining years. If it was a private investors, they would have to borrow at least 7%. So what you're seeing is your taxpayer money being used to subsidize interest rate to welcome private investor to come in and take control of your township's water and wastewater. And this money could easily be used to directly invest it in the community and the township, but instead this is being used to continue a model that has been proven to be flawed and inefficient and costly. The other concern is that before the pandemic, we have also seen the CIB going to various municipal conferences and promote this model, saying that Mapleton they're looking to replicate Mapleton in a lot of other municipalities, oftentimes smaller ones with less capacity for infrastructure investments. And since the pandemic, many federal ministers, including Catherine McKenna, the Minister for Infrastructure and Communities, have indicated that the CIB will play a key role in the infrastructure investments as part of the post-COVID recovery plan. So we should be prepared for an increase in austerity, a push for a privatization agenda that directly targets our water and wastewater projects at a time when we urgently need is better funding, better investment in infrastructure in the community, both to recover from the infrastructure deficit and to recover from the current pandemic.
Wow, was my first reaction after I heard all of those speakers when we did the pre-recording. I thank you all for those interesting, enlightening, and insight-filled presentations. Now, I think all the panelists are going to join me here on the screen. Yes. And there are some questions in the Q&A box, and some of those have been answered. And you can click on the answered category and see some of those answers. We may go over some of those again some more in the live portion of this. But I'm going to start off with a question, and I think I'm going to direct this question toward V. V, the mayor of Mapleton, has been quoted in the media as saying, "Don't worry, we'll still own the asset." Why should we not be comforted by his statement that everything's okay, we still own the asset?
Thank you. I couldn't unmute myself for a second. Yes. So the reality is that what Andrea has gone through and many of the examples Robert have gone through, in fact, are public-private partnerships, which means that the municipality still own the asset, but that still entirely give away the control of services to the private consortium, and that is what the concerning that is really what's concerning to us, because then you lose accountability in terms of how the public can push for and demand clear transparency around water quality or quantity, control rates, and a lot of other issues that influence who gets the water, who gets at what rate, and for how much. And so that's the concerning. The service delivery is ultimately what directly affects Mapleton residents, and is what going to be in private hands for the next 20 years, according to this proposal. And that's what our concerns are.
Okay, I'm going to leave my button unmuted for the whole time so I don't get into mute trouble again. Andrea, so I want to build on that question and ask you this. V was telling us that it appears most of this conversation is going on behind closed doors, that all that's available to the public is a business case, that there are a series of assumptions in that business case which are at best ungrounded and at worst are deceptive. Does this fit a pattern of what you've seen in terms of these contracts being discussed behind closed doors and based on questionable assumptions?
Yeah, for sure. This is the general pattern. All of these negotiations and contracts are subject to non-disclosure, as is the case always in the private sector. And this kind of amplifies what V just said. You know, even though the municipality might still own, 50 or 51% of the shares, the whole kind of culture shifts towards doing things the way corporate actors do things. Among other things, they do things in secret. And so it's always very hard for citizens to gain access to very basic information on what they would consider to be their resource, their utility, which after all they built over sometimes decades of tax paying. They have very little insight in what's actually happening with the utility itself. These contracts are secret, again, because this is now in some ways a utility that acts like a corporation, but they're also secret because they have a lot to hide. I mean, in Berlin, there were articles that were, the most scandalous article was an article where the Berlin Senate, so the political class, promised to Suez and RWE that they would be getting a promised state guaranteed return of investment. No matter how the utility did, they were going to promise, the state was going to promise the privates a return of investments, even if there was a financial shortfall. And that's actually what happened, is in the end, the city of Berlin had to take up new loans to make sure that the privates got their guaranteed return of investment. So there are just stipulations in those contracts that are so problematic from a perspective of what the public good is, that it's no wonder in some ways that they have to be kept secret.
Robert, I want to direct this to you in the following way, that both V and Andrea are telling us what, in their last comments in their presentations, what the risks are. And I was struck by your comment that this is really a fringe idea, that it's been thoroughly discredited in other jurisdictions. So how do you understand why the Canadian government would be pursuing this fringe, discredited idea at this time? How do you understand that?
First of all, yes, this is both internationally, but specifically to Canada. From what our research indicates, only about 1% to 2% of water and wastewater systems are operated privately. So this is not, as you said, this is not common practice. The question as to why this is being pursued is a pretty complicated answer, and I think that we would need a lot more time to go into it. Part of it, though, I think, is that there's a lot of latent capital in Canada looking for investment, And it's one of the reasons that Canadian investment funds and pension plans have invested heavily in international water systems in Latin America and other places, which is incredibly problematic from our point of view. This capital would like domestic opportunities for investment. And this was very clearly the goal of the Canada Infrastructure Bank, was to open up domestic investment opportunities for Canadian capital, private capital, to invest in domestic public services. That's one part of a complicated story, but it's a major factor.
I think I'd like to pose this question to all three of you, and you can sort of wave in whatever order you want to speak to it. But I bring it back to, I think, a comment that V was making around COVID, and that the COVID emergency creates uncertainty. And it makes me think of Naomi Klein's shock doctrine and disaster capitalism. Do you think this creates a greater risk for this kind of privatization to move ahead? Who'd like to speak to that?
I can say yes. I think that this absolutely. I think that the opportunity provided by an even further deterioration of the financial status of a number of many Canadian municipalities at this moment does make the proposals such as the one in Mapleton more attractive.
V or Andrew, would you like to add to that?
Sure, I can add briefly. I think what COVID have also shown us is that you cannot, like the statement water is life cannot be any more relevant. You can't protect yourself and your community without access to, say, clean water. And during the peak of the height of the COVID moments, we've seen a lot of states in the US basically passing resolutions saying that we will stop shutting off people's water when they can't pay, because we know that it is an essential service that people need access to, and it's a violation of human right to take away that access. And so from that lesson that we've learned, it's unconscionable to actually put that essential core service that matters so much to public health in private hands, where public interest and safety is no longer the top concern, but profit is. And I think I think if anything, we should learn from the lesson that we've learned of how important what water is to us when through the pandemic, and push back on and treasure our water and push back on those ideas even further.
Andrea?
Yeah, I just wanted to amplify two things. One is that, the huge global capital liquidity is exactly looking for the chance to invest domestically, but they're also looking for a chance to invest securely. So, I mean, investing in these public utilities is an incredibly secure investment to make in times of economic volatility. So this is for sure something I think that will be exacerbated in the coming years as the unfolding post-pandemic economic crisis sort of unfolds. At the same time, one of the reasons why, austerity-ridden municipalities have gone to banks and to markets is precisely because of this sort of god of balanced budgets. Like, the municipality can't go in the red. It has to balance its budgets. We can't borrow money and so on. And so let's create a joint stock company and they can then borrow the money and that'll be off the books for us, right? That's the logic of the P3. And, at the same time, the pandemic in a weird way has thrown this, has made that emerge as a question as well. Like suddenly the pandemic reveals to us that governments can borrow tons of money if it's really important. And, maybe we don't have to balance budgets if it's really important. And so, as much as I think that the floodgates are now open for privatization because investors are looking for secure domestic investments, I also wonder whether, that argument of, the sacrality of balanced budgets, will hold. I don't know, maybe this is a naive assessment, but I think there's a tension there that's emerged through the pandemic that I think is also an opening, and precisely because the pandemic has revealed how important, access to water is for purely public health reasons.
I think that's a very important insight, Andrea. And people often, I don't know if this is true or not, but often say that the Chinese character for crisis is a combination of two characters, danger and opportunity. And I think that both those things are present here. There's the danger of shock doctrine, opening it up to more disaster capitalism, and there's the opportunity for exactly what you just said. And we've seen some of that. I think I want to just follow this line of conversation for a minute to come back to something V was saying, that the Mapleton, we'll take Mapleton as an example, has pursued other financing for their water needs and has been unable to secure those. And so I have kind of a two-part question here. One is, what's the root problem of that? Is it the austerity budget attitude that Andrew just described? Do you think it's an actual strategy to drive municipalities to the privatization market? And what are the alternatives in this moment? I think, I can't remember if it was V or Robert, we're talking about, infrastructure money through the province. So what's the root problem of why Mapleton can't access public financing, for lack of a better word? And what are the alternatives to this privatization initiative? Robert, let's give you a first crack at that.
Sure, that's another big question. I'd say, so it's true, Mapleton has in the past sought both federal and provincial funding for some smaller infrastructure projects unsuccessfully. It's not clear exactly what they pursued in regard to the water and wastewater system. I'm not sure that they pursued. It's not clear in the material that we have or in the PwC business case that those federal funding opportunities were pursued. This government, the Trudeau government, initiated a number of different water and wastewater specific funds that would have provided opportunities for something like this. That being said, another point revealed in the business case is that the township of Mapleton actually does have the fiscal room to do this itself through borrowing, and so I suppose the decision to go this route was probably a combination of the work of the sort of lobbying work that a number of stakeholders that are aligned with the Canada Infrastructure Bank, such as PricewaterhouseCoopers and other accounting and consulting firms, have been doing across the country for a long time, and the profile that the Canada Infrastructure Bank has been trying to bring to the sector over the past couple of years.
I find that very interesting when you tell us that they have the fiscal room. There's a couple of questions in the questions window over here about First Nations. And water is essential, water is life. And there's a couple of questions here about what about First Nations that lack access to clean water? Are P3s being promoted as a solution to their need? There was another question that somebody may have answered and I've lost it, but see if I can find that. Well, there was another First Nations related question. So what do what's your comment about this? Are they being promoted as a solution for First Nations water security issues? You're nodding, Robert. V, do you have a comment on this?
I think to a certain extent there is P3s being promoted as among Indigenous communities, and I don't know as much about the details of this, but I think Robert have some insights about like the Public-Private Partnership Canada conference and some promotion of public-private partnerships in Inuit communities.
Yeah, I would just say that over the past few years, the CCPPP, the Canadian Council for Public-Private Partnerships, has been promoting and working with Indigenous communities intensely to promote P3s in those communities as a solution to any number of infrastructure shortfalls, really, I mean, I personally have a lot of sympathy for the communities that have been neglected by the federal government for so long, and who feel like, you know, well, at this point, anything's better than nothing. So, but it's true. It has been promoted for sure.
We have a question that's come up in the chat box, and it's something like this. What about water bonds so that people will still own their water, call it a water conservancy like nature conservancies, and deny governments and business access? I'm not quite sure what a water bond is, Andrea, but I'm wondering if you've got some insight into this or a comment.
Sorry, where is this question? The idea of
a water bond.
Of the public itself owning?
Yeah.
I don't actually know very much about this possible model. I wonder whether Public Services International, which has, thought very closely about alternatives to both PPP and to full privatization, and has thought about, public-public partnerships, actually, which I know maybe some of you know a little bit more about. I haven't heard very much about water bonds as a solution or an experiment, but does anyone else know about this possible model?
He's shaking her head, Robert's shaking their head. So
Nothing
maybe Jay, you can
specific.
send us an email about that, and we can share that around to people as an ongoing conversation.
Yeah.
Jeanette has a question. When I talk to people about P3s, a common response is, of course, private companies will be efficient, take good care of business as their profits depend on it. Therefore, they're a great option. After all, we can't depend on government for anything, for everything. Any good ideas on how to respond to this?
I can take that.
Okay, V.
So yeah, it's a common reaction to P3s as well. It's the assumption that private is always better. And I think the best response to that is a couple of reports that I have looked at in the aftermath of the Walkerton water crisis right here in Ontario, where there's been scrutiny and reports into the various models of water governance and how that affects, like we said, something that is an essential service. And they've shown that a private company is less likely to make precautionary or above and beyond investment to protect the water, to ensure water quality in the public interest, because it's not good for bottom line. They're less likely to say structure the pricing scheme in a way that encourages conservation, which is good for us for water conservation, but also not good for bottom line. There's a lot of issues, but decisions that a private entity would make that will first and foremost to make sure that there's profit down the road, and less so about prioritizing the public interest. And so those are the core. Those are often what I would counter those arguments with.
Go ahead, Andrea.
I just wanted to add here that, on the one hand, there's lots of arguments against PPPs. But, you know, the case here in Canada is also, you know, quite hard to make if you think about the recent scandal around lead, you know, in the water. And when that scandal broke, you know, my heart just sank, because I felt that that's just another, you know, opening for precisely, you know, privates to argue that, you know, we would have done it so much better, even though, of course, we know that's not necessarily the case. You know, so the problem is that public ownership is also not always a solution, both in terms of, you know, care for the actual ecosystem, but also I saw here the Great Lakes Commons, Paul here says that, you know, public ownership can also be very corporate. It can be very financialized, and they can use the same pricing mechanisms. They can have the same kind of culture in some ways that corporations have. And so, you know, this is where, you know, good journalism, good public pressure, you know, holding public, you know, representatives accountable is so key when it comes to this particular rules, because in some ways, both sides, you know, fail very significantly, and they have in Europe, but also here.
Robert.
To tack on to what Andrea said, I think that's why transparency is so important, you know, with public ownership, at least the service would be subject to disclosure, whereas with these P3s and private operation, we see that so much is shielded from public view.
Mm-hmm.
This is a rich conversation we're having, and I appreciate that you're letting me just sort of popcorn these questions at you, and I'm going to do a few more because we have a very engaged audience here. So, excuse me, to what extent does the NAFTA 2, whatever we call this new NAFTA, interfere or prevent remunicipalizing? So let's say Mapleton became privatized and we wanted to remunicipalize it. Is NAFTA an obstacle to that? Anybody have an opinion?
I'll jump in just with the caveat that this is not my area of expertise, but from what I understand in previous trade agreements, the investor dispute resolution process sometimes would stand in the way of bringing services back in house or deprivatizing services that had already been under contract with foreign private companies. I think that dispute resolution process has been altered in the new version of the trade agreement. So so that might be an improvement, in fact.
Do you have a follow-up?
But others may know more about this than me.
What do you think, V?
Yeah, I'm also going to preface by saying that we have a trade campaigner and I'm not it. But yeah, so that's correct. The new NAFTA, or CUSMA is now they're calling it, does remove the ISDS clause, which is the investor state dispute clause that allow private company to sue government. It doesn't take effect for a few years, even though NAFTA took effect a few days ago, 14 days ago. So there's still a small window for a couple, for ISDS to take effect. And we at the council know of some examples of some Canadian mining company trying to sue Mexico. For example, this is news that just broke earlier this week by my colleagues. But yeah, as far as I'm concerned, we as I know, ISDS clause is still in place for a little bit longer, but until the full new NAFTA take effect, in which case there won't be any more ISDS.
Staying at the international level for a second, one of the questions is Canada promoting P3s internationally? Like, is this quote unquote just a national strategy through the Canada Infrastructure Bank, or is Canada promoting this internationally? Are you moving your head, Andrea, because you have a comment?
Oh, I don't know exactly about Canada, but I can tell you that the EU and all European nations are absolutely folding the P3 project into their development projects, with banks increasingly being involved in development, which, you know, again, the whole logic has become so financialized. So the public-private model, public-private partnership model is, in very unethical ways being promoted, say, in Greece by the Germans, even though the Germans themselves, in most cases, overwhelmingly, their water is private, but they force the Greeks to to privatize. Sorry, in Germany, the water in most cases is publicly held, but they force, for example, the Greeks to privatize their water, and this extends, far beyond the borders of Europe as well. So there's a real, double. What's the right word? Yeah, they do one thing at home, like remunicipalize in France at home, but then they promote the model elsewhere. French development corporations, for example, as well.
Just a little shout out, by the way, I saw in the participants that somebody has signed on from Greece. So I'm glad you're in the conversation with us today. And I'm glad you're in the conversation with us today. Robert, did you want to add something? I couldn't tell there. Were you twitching to say something?
Yes, just to address the question as well. I think that it's absolutely clear that Canada is promoting this internationally. They are, as Andrea was mentioning, Canada is actually one of the leaders in this push to tie development aid to privatization, which is really unfortunate. So it is both a domestic project and an international project. And again, it comes back to this sort of Canadian latent capital that is looking for places to go.
I think we're almost done the Q&A part of this. And I see that there's a very rich conversation that's been going on in the chat box, and people are sharing links and all kinds of good things are going on. And this is all going to be available to you afterwards as a resource. And we're going to start to pivot towards the strategy conversation as we start to move towards wrapping up. But one of the questions is it possible for Ontario to have a referendum about this? Is there a jurisdiction issue in a way that Ontario could say no privatization of municipal water systems? Anybody?
Is there a lawyer in the room somewhere who knows the law? That would be great to know.
Yeah, I am not aware of that process, but I know that the Council's Blue Communities Project has essentially been trying to work at this from the ground up. So one of the 3 resolutions at a municipality passes as part of a Blue Community resolution is to say we will say no to privatization of P3s of water and wastewater services. And so essentially you're, as a municipality, you're inoculating yourself from future threats of privatization. And we have been very encouraged to have over close to 40 communities across Canada that's done so, and many, many more around the world. Andrea has referred to like Paris and Berlin, who've all decided to sign on as blue communities to reaffirm their commitment after they remunicipalize their water services. And so we're excited to be working with many of you folks too, if you want to become a blue community.
Okay, so I'm going to kind of do a bit of a strategy wrap up, and in doing that, I'm going to give each of you, when I'm done, one more opportunity to comment as whatever kind of closing comment you want to make, and then we're going to start to wrap up. So I think there's agreement that the proposal in Mapleton is a deep concern. It's a concern locally, but it's also a concern because it's an attempt by the Canada Infrastructure Bank to pilot something that could happen in other places. So if we can stop it here, we can stop at other places too. The other thing is that it's, a local case example is always a good way to reveal the larger issues. That sometimes when we talk about these issues at a broad policy level, people go, okay, but what do I do? Well, Mapleton provides a very clear example of what do we do to stop it. Now, it is a problem. There's a couple of things that are a problem, or challenges, let me put it that way, challenges to a campaign. One is that Mapleton has not been transparent and has not shared the information, and has conducted everything in camera, essentially. And so that's challenge number 1. Challenge number 2 is that the physical distancing to manage the COVID emergency has removed people from the ability to have direct access to their council and to put direct pressure on them. And third, we don't have a lot of contact with people who are actually in that community for a variety of reasons. Part of it being because it's or rural community, and we're not, it's not as directly connected to the Water Watchers or to the Council of Canadians. And CUPE the current water system there, the workers there are not members of CUPE. So we don't have an easy in to the community yet. Having said that, we're all talking about that, the Council of Canadians, the Water Watchers, we're talking about some kind of a campaign to connect with people locally, to raise awareness, to draw people out around this, to put pressure on the council to make public that which is largely private. So that's the way we're headed. We can't announce details of the campaign yet because we're still thinking that all through. But at the end of this webinar and in a follow-up email that we'll send to you, you can sign on to a list to say you're interested in being involved. If you know people in Mapleton, you can talk to them about this and encourage them to contact the Water Watchers or the Council of Canadians. We'll draw them into this campaign and we will be moving forward. This is an important topic, and while we're sharing information about it, we're also, this is the first step in developing a campaign to say no to Mapleton. I was kind of kidding around. I don't know if I can say this the right way, but Leonard Cohen has a famous song, and I think we should adapt it somehow. You know, first they stopped Berlin, and now we'll take Mapleton, something like that. Oh wow, that was my little pun for the day. Okay, so I'm going to ask each of our panelists to make any kind of closing comment they want to make about the strategy, about about moving forward. And then I'm going to let people make any closing comments they want to make in the chat box. And then I think we've got a final slide with some information on it maybe, and we'll wrap up. So in no particular order, V, I'll give you a 10-second warning. Is there anything you'd like to say as a closing comment about the strategy and or the need to stop this project in Mapleton?
Yes, absolutely. If you live in Mapleton or know someone who does, there's a real opportunity to push back on the federal government's agenda to promote water P3s in Canada. So so hope you get involved and ask questions, demand transparency from the township council, and we must know what the township is signing up for before it's too late, and 20 years is a long time to wait for terrible service. So yeah, and nowhere and anywhere else in Canada, there's also opportunity to advocate for better federal and provincial infrastructure funding, so that municipalities don't have to face this decision and communities don't have to run the risk of losing control of their water.
Thank you, V. Robert, closing comment?
Sure. I'll just say that the evangelists for P3s often say that, you know, P3s always come in on time and on budget and cost less. The research, there is very little evidence to support those contentions. I have an economist friend who says the only way that business cases for P3s work is by keeping the numbers secret. So I would just echo V in saying demand transparency in Mapleton. And be skeptical about claims from both the Canada Infrastructure Bank and from firms that are tied to P3s about the success of these.
Thank you. Andrea, closing comment?
Well, I think the beauty about this whole debate is that, you know, we can look at the hard numbers and the auditor's reports and see that, you know, it just doesn't work from a fiscal perspective. I think that has been shown. But then, you know, there's also so many philosophical questions that are raised here. Are we really gonna, you know, sell off parts of this utility that was built in many ways by us through our taxpayers' money, through our labor and so on, and then, you know, see prices, water prices rise and debts rise, and then have not just us, but really future generations be indebted because of this deal. So there's a way in which I think water itself, because it's, you know, commonly shared, it flows across generations. There's many you know, good arguments to be made, both fiscal and philosophical, about this across generations. That's very important, and relations, let's put it this way. Yeah.
Andrea, I like your comment that water flows across generations, and we in fact need to guarantee that it flows across generations. We can't guarantee that. This has been a very rich conversation. Andrea, Robert, thank you very much for being with us today. Your presentations, the comments in the chat box, the live Q&A, I actually think it's given us all the content we need for the campaign. I mean, we can write our campaign literature just right out of these things that you've said today and provide this available to people. I see that there are lots of comments happening in the chat box, appreciating people. And I just want to read one out because I think it's a good summary. Thanks to the Water Watchers and all the fantastic panelists for sharing their presentations and knowledge with all of us. Wonderful work by all of you on behalf of the public good. So you may want to put other comments in the chat. So we'll leave the chat box open for a bit while you do that. I want to do a shout out to Megan Clout and Danny Lindemood, who are behind the cameras and behind the scenes and who organized this event from start to end and made it all happen. Thank you, thank you. If you haven't found the applause button on your chat, you can applaud for them too. And I think there's a last slide, Megan, that we're going to put up. We just want to promote that we have something we call water dialogues. So today was a very one-way kind of presentation. We were doing all the talking, you were asking some questions. But at the water dialogue, we open it up and provide an opportunity for you to talk more with each other about this and what it means. Last night, we had a very successful evening event talking about the sale, Nestle, of selling their operations in Canada to Ice River. One feature of that was a short presentation on the Movement Action Plan, which is a framework for understanding how movements can be successful and how to develop strategy. We're having a follow-up, more detailed seminar on that on Monday, July the 27th. This webinar is part of a series of activities that the Water Watchers are organizing as part of the People's Water Campaign and is leading up to a People's Water Convention on September 26th. It's called Watershed 2020 Towards Water Justice in Ontario. You will be receiving an email with links that would allow you to sign up to all of these, any and all of these. You can pre-register now for the Watershed 2020 convention. You'll be receiving an email. We will also provide a link to this. Some people were asking the chat box if it would be available because either there were glitches in their own reception today, or they want to review another time, or they'd like to share with other people. So we will be sending you those resources. I think that brings us to the conclusion of today's event. Water is for life, not profit. Resisting water privatization is part of ensuring water is for life, not profit. We look forward to seeing you again in the next opportunity that we have to engage. Goodbye, everybody, and have a good day.